So the next two slides, so we'll move on to the next one. These are facts and figures from our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And as those are getting up on the screen for you, I'm going to give you a little bit of a heads up. These two slides, oh, we're going to do our polls first, sorry. So what brings you to this webinar? And you can choose more than one, because a lot of us wear lots of different hats in this space. So take a moment and make sure to scroll down, because there are some options that are not readily obvious to you when you're first looking at the screen. I'll give you a minute to do that.
Okay, I'll be ending the poll in about another 10 seconds.
Great. Okay, so we have 4% of people with us today are living with a brain injury, 7% family members. We have folks working in community service agencies, local programs, federal programs, aging and disability services, wonderful clinicians. Fabulous. So we have a wide spectrum of people who work with folks who are living with brain injury. That's great. Thank you. I hope we can touch a need of all of you as you're working with folks who are living with brain injury. So now I am going to go to the data. And again, I'm not going to read statistics off to you in great detail, but I do want to paint the picture of brain injury. Our researchers tell us that people in general have 3 peak times in our lives when we are vulnerable to incurring a traumatic brain injury. And those times of life include childhood, and that's primarily due to falls. So kids are more likely to fall, than little kids, than a mature adult. Adolescence and young adulthood, so motor vehicle accidents and unintentional injury is what causes our young adults and our adolescents to be at risk for brain injury. And I want to mention that for these two groups, young adults and adolescents, there can be, in particular, lifelong consequences, and also children too can be affected long-term, of course. But sometimes kids, adolescents, young adults, they can make remarkable physical recovery, but the lifelong consequence that can impede their trajectory into adulthood and increase the risk of behavioral health challenges such as substance use disorder and other barriers related to damage that perhaps the part of our brain that controls our adult thinking, that part of the brain might not catch up. And so young people, as they grow into adulthood, may have difficulty self-regulating and meeting the milestones of adulthood in the way that we would expect because of that earlier history of brain injury. So brain injury, as I say, can sometimes be very sneaky. And it could be a factor in somebody's life and we might not know it. They may not know it. And then the third peak is older adults. And older adults are at risk of incurring a brain injury due to falls because of decreased balance and reaction time, the effects of medication, and normal age-related changes to the brain that can increase the risk of bleeding and subsequent injury. And I say this because, you know, our aging population is growing. Just the baby boomers are going through the python there of our population. And so if older adults fall, the consequences can be much more severe than if they fell 10, 20 years earlier. So the normal age-related changes I mentioned are related to just, again, normal shrinking, changing of the brain structure that just makes the brain a little bit more vulnerable to a sudden hit or a jolt, a fall. So if an older adult has fallen, best to be very cautious and make sure they get checked out so that there isn't a problem moving forward. So moving on to our next slide about brain injury and its systems. And you can go on to the next one. And I'm wondering if the poll can be taken off my screen. There it is. Now I can see you. Okay, so there is no defined system for brain injury. So because of advances in trauma care, those who wouldn't have survived their injuries at an earlier time in history are now surviving. And this really started in the 80s and the late 70s with excellent trauma care practices that were brought over here actually from some of the work done in Vietnam. And so now we had this cohort of young people and others who are surviving brain injuries. And in Massachusetts, there was a group of parents who realized that once their young adult children reached the point where they're ready to engage in the community after their traumatic brain injuries, that there was gaps in services. And so that group of parents founded the National Head Injury Foundation in 1980. So that is really the first advocacy group dedicated to identifying gaps in services and advocating for those gaps to be filled. And that is now known as our Brain Injury Association of America. And those individuals really helped advocate for some of the slides, for some of the services and supports that are going to be on the next few slides. So let's talk about dedicated funding at the state level. This is just kind of a broad overview of some of those initiatives that began in the 80s. So I'm going to talk about each one of those in turn. So we can move on to the next slide. So this looks kind of like a patchwork. This is our country represented in blue and white and red, where states that have dedicated funding. So with dedicated funding, states have appropriated funding. The state legislature, the governor, have dedicated funding to support brain injury services and supports for their citizens. The first state to have done this was Pennsylvania back in '85. So that's one source of supports, and not every state has dedicated funding for people living with brain injuries. Another stream of support for some people in some states are dedicated trust funds, and those generate revenue commonly through traffic violation fines, and they're used to fund a variety of services such as research, supports, and prevention efforts. In either case, a dedicated funding or a trust fund, just about every state across the country has a brain injury advisory board or council, and that is comprised of professionals and advocates and families and individuals with lived experience who advise the states how to use the brain injury dedicated funding, and they also report to the board, and the board reports to the governor and state legislators regarding recommendations for needed supports. And there are 24 states who have trust funds across the country. The next source of funding, and then the next slide, is I'm going to talk a little bit about, you can go on. I'm going to talk about acquired brain injury or traumatic brain injury, home and community-based services, or HCBS programs. So these are from Medicaid. In general, Medicaid allows states some flexibility in providing services to individuals within their homes and communities, as opposed to facility-based care. So this is a person-centered practice for sure. And throughout this country, we have at least 23 states that have specialized brain injury waivers, as well as non-brain injury specific waivers for individuals with disabilities and older adults that just also happen to serve people living with brain injuries. Some states will just allow their waivers to be used in the community. Other waivers allow for specialized programs where there's residential services. And I just want to note that Medicaid is a federal and state program, and so each waiver is really unique to its state. It really is designed to meet the needs of that specific state based on what the advocates and what the legislature feels is necessary. So I do now want to talk a little bit about our state agencies for traumatic brain injury. We are very lucky that the Administration for Community Living administers the Federal Traumatic Brain Injury Partnership Grant Program. And since, I think it was '96, Congress has allotted money to fund, and this again was on the efforts of our National Head Injury Foundation and our Brain Injury Association of America, who came together with families and people lived experience and really advocated at the federal level. And so these programs administered by ACL help states expand access to services and supports for individuals throughout their lifetime. And there's 27 states currently funded, and the grants are housed within their state's lead agency. So what you see on the screen now is a representative of where some of these programs are housed. And again, everyone is different. Every time a new grant is released by ACL, we are given guidance as to what they want us to focus on, what are the needs across the country. But as you can see, they really vary. In Maryland, we are located in the Behavioral Health Administration. In Nebraska and Massachusetts, they're in their state vocational rehabilitation program. So that's a very general description, but the state programs are really designed to expand capacity and systems to be more person-centered and brain injury informed. So for more information about any of those programs, so the trust funds, the dedicated appropriated funding, and for the Medicaid and the state agencies, you can go to your local brain injury association or alliance, or of course the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators. So I'm now going to talk now to really with the meat of the issue here, and that is understanding what some common experiences after brain injury are for people, and how folks should be and could be supported in a person-centered practice. This is not a comprehensive list, what you're seeing on the right side of your screen. And when I say person-centered, one size, again, does not fit all in terms of suggesting accommodations and strategies. So for example, if you are working in services and you know a person is living with brain injury, and it is very common for people living with brain injury to say, you know, the biggest thing I'm dealing with right now is my memory. I've had that experience when I worked in programs. So somebody says, you know, my memory is a problem. There are many supports, many evidence-based practices for helping people support their memory. But we urge professionals who are just want to do the best by people to stop and ask, what have you done for your memory support? Is there something that you use that really is working out well? Would you be interested in us talking about maybe some other options you may not be aware of? And this should be that conversation up front, and really enlist that person's needs, their strengths. And together you can explore additional strategies that suit them. So if somebody is really good with technology, there are some great apps that have been vetted for use by people with cognitive disabilities. Or perhaps they prefer concrete strategies such as to-do lists or calendars on the wall. People with attention and concentration problems find their memory improves once they master strategies that help them focus. So, you know, for that person, it could be highlighting written material, taking frequent breaks, working with noise canceling headphones, or working in a cubicle. And my point by kind of combining these symptoms of brain injury is that you know, our memory is really reliant on our attention and concentration. So if you want to address memory, you might really work with a person to find out, well, gee, I'm wondering if you have a trouble like persisting and attending to a conversation, or do you get lost in a room when lots of people are talking? You know, how can we help you increase your ability to focus and attend? And oftentimes people will report, gee, my memory's quite a bit better now. I don't feel so distracted. The other thing that people may have issues with is they may be impulsive, and that's typically related to injury to their frontal or temporal lobes. They find themselves saying something or doing something that they didn't mean to. It can result in people taking it the wrong way, or people misunderstanding them, you know, getting in trouble with the boss, getting you know, their spouse or their partner upset with them. So how can people be assisted to kind of reduce that tendency? Well, learning that it's there and suggestions for working around it could be, why don't you use some organizational strategies? Take a pause in the action, so to speak. If you have a thought that comes to mind, think about it before you share it with somebody else. Jotting down step-by-step approaches to a problem or a situation, consulting a trusted friend, family member, or professional are always good ways to work on organization and problem solving, with the added benefit of reducing anxiety and increasing feelings of competency. And again, if all those factors are felt that people feel less anxious and less out of control, they're able to focus. And again, memory sometimes will do some remarkable improvements. And then if you don't know somebody is living with a brain injury, somebody comes into the Aging and Disability Resource Center, and say the intake person or the options counselor is starting to do the intake process, it's always a good idea to screen and or ask for a possible history of brain injury, because then I'll give you a clue as to how to start the conversation about supporting people. So next slide. Let me get a chance. So some of the other things that people will experience after brain injury, in addition to cognitive or behavioral challenges, is coordination, memory control, visual issues. And again, no one size fits all. And sometimes a strategy can do double or triple duty. For example, when someone with a visual impairment that has difficulty, causes them to have difficulty to see out of one side of their visual field, say it's a left-sided problem. So in that case, I have what's called a neglect. I'm not seeing what's in this part of my visual field. That is so frustrating. It's difficult for me to navigate the environment. It's difficult for me to read. I'm somebody who likes to read. So one thing that is a very simple strategy is you take an index card and you put some red with a marker on one edge of it, and then that person can use that edge to focus on the text, to follow the line of that red with their eye. So what happens in that case is that the person is increasing their comprehension because they can see the whole page because they're using that red line to guide their vision across the text. It will help them focus. So that's the cognitive and reading and comprehension, hopefully memory. But say that same visual issue is causing them, that individual, to startle. Somebody comes at me from my left visual field where I can't see them, it scares me. And instead of initially saying, hey, what's going on, who's there, I may strike out, I may curse, I may become belligerent. And so staff who are not brain injury informed might think, oh, this person's so difficult, and their peers in the facility or in the community dwelling or their family members start to kind of pull away, and that person becomes isolated. So that's another example of how organic brain injury related issues can translate or have implications for quality of life. So what can you do in that situation? Well, you let people know that's what's going on with the person. You really help the person, you coach them to advocate for themselves, maybe suggest that they put a sign on their door or on the back of their wheelchair, come at me from the right, announce yourself before you come in. And that will help, people feel a little bit more relaxed and more in control of their emotions. So these strategies that I'm recommending, and again, this is just the tip of the iceberg, but a lot of them can do double and triple duty. So you need to ask what the person's dealing with and then, kind of brainstorm as to what is going to work for them. So now I want to talk about, in the next slide, I want to talk about unrecognized and hidden traumatic brain injuries. So I mentioned earlier that, we have our grant at the Maryland Behavioral Health Administration, and that's where I sit. And part of my job is educating behavioral health professionals, so those who work in mental health programs and substance use related disorder, people who are receiving services for substance use related disorder, and also our older adults, our ADRCs and our departments of aging. And this is the drum that I bang, that there are people that you may be seeing in your services. I talk to police, I talk to people working with victims of an intimate partner violence, that if you understand that there is a possibility of a brain injury among the people that you're working with, the homeless, our veterans, then you can be more brain injury informed and person-centered by talking to those individuals about some supports that might help them navigate the world. start with that screening, start with that conversation, ask them where they're having some issues, and ask them if they've ever had a time in their lives where they've had a blow to the head. And that can really open up the conversation and give you some ideas about how you can support them so that they can, meet their personal goals. Now I want to turn the conversation over to Kelly and Ann and ask them some questions about their experiences. So the first person I'm going to ask is Kelly. Kelly, can you share some experiences around what your lives, because we're talking not just about you, but about your daughter and daughters, your two daughters experienced before you and your daughter experienced the brain injury, and what was life like for you before that motor vehicle accident?
Thanks for having me on this. Life before the accident was great. I was a stay-at-home mom to two, beautiful little girls, 5 and 3. The plan had been that I would return to work once Olivia, the youngest at the time, went to school full time. And we had recently moved into a brand new home right after September 11th. And Olivia had started preschool on September 11th, unfortunately. And Hannah was in kindergarten. She was my oldest. And we had, like I said, a great life. Olivia was, I love the age of 3 because I find it's very, they're learning new things. They're having new experiences. It's a very fun age. It can be rough with the temper tantrums still, but, and Olivia was all about that. She was very stubborn. But that stubbornness helped her in the long run. She was what I would call a very happy-go-lucky little girl. She would, as long as play was involved, she was great. And especially loved figurines of all the, especially the Disney movies, Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, and 101 Dalmatians were her favorite. And we just had what I would call a very good life. Our biggest issue was I had a miscarriage that previous August, but I had recovered. And unfortunately, my husband got laid off about 3 weeks prior to the accident. So it was a bit of a stressful time. We had moved and then he got laid off a week later. But those were the worst things, that had happened to us. We consider ourselves very lucky.
Asia, I believe you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to put background noise on you, Kelly. So I'm going to repeat myself. Can you share some of the challenges that you experienced, you and your daughter, in terms of your health and well-being as a result of that brain injury?
Well, the first challenge we had was when she was still in a coma, because hers was classified as a severe TBI. She was code blue at the scene. So she was still in the coma, and the hospital came to me and said, we have to transfer her to a pediatric facility. But unfortunately, there's not one in our area. So I live in a fairly metropolitan area right outside Washington, D.C., and we were told that we had to go at least 2 hours away, either north or south. So that was pretty difficult. And once we got to the rehab, I found that they had a set structure of what they wanted her to achieve before getting released. And we pushed them very, very hard to get her to reach those milestones before, as quick as possible. And that included having therapies on the weekends, giving her access to enough of the foods she liked, things like that. The health consequences that have resulted weren't apparent in the beginning, so she didn't have seizures or anything. But as she's gotten older, she had the right peripheral vision was lost, but we didn't know that until 13 years later. She has OCD, post-traumatic stress disorder. She has huge fears of loud noises, being in the dark, wouldn't go into a movie theater for years. We still have to I carry earplugs with me wherever we go. She has depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, short-term memory is and was huge, and also word retrieving difficulty. And she also, her gait and balance are off, but the average person doesn't realize it. You have to know her really well to actually see it. She does walk towards her right due to the vision issue. And a lot of cognitive issues have developed. You know, you mentioned learning to, reading. Learning to read was very, very difficult. And also the spatial issues. Walking on any type of incline or even riding on an escalator. It took years to get her on an escalator. And she will not fly in an airplane. When she was very young, we medicated her, but she's too old for that now. Well, she's not too old, it's just we have to medicate her a lot. And we've, tried to do TSA has a program where you can go, kids can go and adults if you have sensory issues, and we've done all that, and she's great until we get to the gate. And at the gate, she panics, even though she knows the plane's not going to move. My injury wasn't diagnosed, as you said, until a couple months later. And my biggest issue was cognitive. I couldn't multitask. I was having very fatigued, which Olivia also has. Olivia also has the fatigue and a huge migraines. And then I had carpal tunnel syndrome in both my hands, so I had surgery to repair those. And I also had some, herniated discs in my neck, and I just received physical therapy for all that. But my main focus has been on Olivia. And as far as my oldest daughter, she really didn't have an injury other than emotional, and so she was treated for PTSD for some time.
Thank you. Could you describe briefly what the process of accessing appropriate treatments and services was like for you?
It was
Family?
difficult. For Olivia, it was really hard because pediatric brain injury wasn't, hardly anyone knew what it was at the time. We're talking back in 2001. So finding any type of therapy with a brain injury for pediatric was next to impossible. We were lucky in that I found a speech therapist whose mother actually had also been a speech therapist with brain injury. So we used her as a resource. So that was difficult. Also finding mental health therapists in brain injury was really difficult. We probably went through 9 or 10 therapists before we found one who did not have brain injury, but she does the research and she reaches out to the people in the know, and she gets the answers and of how to help her. I had a little bit of cognitive therapy right after, but it was still in the new phases of cognitive therapy, and the therapist wasn't very, she was actually filling in for someone who was on maternity leave, and it was a waste of time. I think I just came up with my own compensation strategies, writing lists and doing things like that. Teaching those to Olivia is very difficult. I think that, so I would say that finding the resources was very difficult, especially living in this area, whereas I would expect that someone living in a more rural area would have even more difficult time.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anne, I'm going to pretty much ask you to share with us what your experiences were like, starting with what was it like for you before the injury?
It's great to be here also. It's now so long ago, it's almost hard to talk about what my pre-injury or remember what my pre-injury life was like, but I was, I had gone to graduate school in economics and had moved to Washington to work on research and policy issues at the Environmental Law Institute, which is a think tank
Wow.
in Washington, D.C. I was the senior economist, so I led a group of economists and we worked with lawyers. That was my work, and I was an athlete. I'd been an athlete all my life, and I played competitive volleyball indoor and then eventually out in the sand pits by the mall. Sand pits, the sand, the sand courts on the mall. I also co-coached, one of my friend's daughters had a soccer team out in Maryland, and we coached together. That was a lot of fun. Had a really active social life, and lots of friends and lots of colleagues who were friends. And I was fortunate in that my job took me to other parts of the world to give lectures or to lecture to people when they came into Washington, bureaucrats when they came into Washington from other countries. I also had some great vacations. And this was kind of the life that I had worked really hard to have. I'd gone to school for, worked really hard to have, and all of a sudden it wasn't. Yeah, that's.
Anastasia, I think you're on mute again.
What was your, sorry. So Anne, I'm wondering if like Kelly, if you can explain a little bit of, what your health experiences were, where you had some issues, and trying to find those services that met your needs. What was your experience like?
Sure. So I had a mild traumatic brain injury in a car accident long before, in 1997, which was long before people associated long-term symptoms with concussion. And so they need the word, a mild TBI is often called a concussion. And so there's a real lack, let's just say there's a real lack of awareness of concussions and what services we needed. And sadly, I see some of that still today, a lot of that still today. In my case, my head swung from side to side and back to forward. And my car was, hardly touched. I was hit from behind, but connections in all, unbeknownst to me, connections in all areas of my brain were either stretched or broken. And I, the three things: I couldn't drive, I couldn't work, and I couldn't live my life. And I will say that I'm over 20 years out at this point, and I'm still recovering. So I found a path to recovery. And what's always been interesting to me is oftentimes people can't see the injury, they can see the recovery. And the people who know you well can see that you're really different. But most people who don't know you, meet you for the first time, just have no idea what you're going through. I had, I actually drove home from the accident and did not drive. Realized that if I wasn't processing things at a very fast speed, I was processing very, very slowly, I shouldn't be driving. And I actually am really lucky that I'm still alive, in that I was driving out a major highway 270 into Maryland, going to church, and felt that my left leg was going numb. And I'm just really grateful that I was able to stop the car. Actually, my right leg was going numb. I was able to stop my car with the left leg, and am going from 70 miles per hour. And that was the beginning of realizing maybe that was 2 weeks after the injury, and that it wasn't, that was sort of a wake-up call, that there was more to it than what I thought. My symptoms, were tremendous fatigue. But I mean, the thing about, to me, mild traumatic brain injury is that I couldn't, the injured brain can't figure out what's wrong. And so, I was fortunate. I had a wonderful neurologist who, top DC neurologists who said, you have a mild traumatic brain injury, rest and go back to work. And so I was properly diagnosed, but I had no idea what that meant. And in fact, the word mild was the only thing I understood about traumatic brain injury, and how bad could mild be? You know, I've since heard that that mild is never mild when you are talking about the brain. And so my symptoms were not short-lived, and it seemed to me that it was this process of going and finding different people who could help me understand what was wrong. I was very fortunate in that my doctor, my first doctor didn't know me. My first doctor didn't know me. The doctor I moved to was somebody whose daughter I had coached. And so she knew me. And so she had a really good, understanding, we've got to get you better. But she also didn't know that much about traumatic, she would send me off in different directions. I had tremendous fatigue. I had difficulty reading and comprehension, which actually got me to a optometrist, and I was a very highly respected optometrist in DC who was able to start a lot of rehab when my doctors were questioning or were not giving me rehab, my neurologist or my neurologist. I had 3.5 years later, when I finally got to a speech and language therapist, I was diagnosed with aphasia, which means difficulty with language. I was very aware that I was having difficulty with language. And ataxia, which is, you can think it here, but moving it to the mouth and articulating it. And a number of other things that I could never even pronounce the Latin until recently, or the medical term until recently. I've been treated for balance issues from the vision, from the vestibular system, which is the inner ear, and from touch, your feet touching the ground. I've had major sleep issues. 7 years out, I was treated for sleep apnea, which helped me quite a bit. I have sleep disorders. And I should say that early on, there was a concern that I was having a possible seizure when my right side went numb. Anything else?
No, I think you really covered it. I know that you had made a note to me that you had over 10 doctors at one time. And I don't think it's unusual for
it's
people.
not unusual.
Yeah, who experience. Yeah.
That's right. That you have different doctors treating you for different things and seeing different parts of you, and then also they're just you have, even before you're sick, you might have 2 or 3 different doctors that are looking at you for different parts of your body. And then,
It's piecemeal.
Piecemeal, very piecemeal, because nobody was talking to each other. I was the person talking to each other.
So you were your own case manager.
I
Even
was
as you were trying to get better.
And the least qualified of anybody there to be my own case manager with me.
I don't know if I'd say that, but thank you. I think you really gave a very good picture of what it looks like to have to kind of do through trial and error, get the help that you need. So thank you.
Well, and it wasn't like I could go back to work. So it was very obvious to me something's wrong, right? And I should be getting help.
Yep.
And my insurance was helping me to some extent, but that, something wasn't happening that to me was sort of obvious should be happening.
Sure.
And I'd find knowledgeable doctors. I'd find doctors that weren't validating my symptoms. And I would also find, that people just, the term malinger, I heard the term malinger more than once. And as a PhD, I kind of felt like, man, if this is what's happening to me, what's this like for other people?
Right. Thank you. Thank you. So now we're going to go on, and we just want you all to be aware of some of the definitions around person-centered practices. So when we're talking about person-centered thinking, that's really a foundational principle, and it requires that people have actions and values that reveal a respect for the people that they are working with and their supporters, their loved ones, and that they are experts in their own lives. You know, one of the things that my colleague was talking about when addressing an issue that came up with one of our brain injury waiver participants is that we really have to allow people the dignity of trying something, the dignity of risk, and all these things are part of person-centered thinking. Person-centered planning refers to the methodology that identifies and addresses preferences and interests that make up a desired life, and then the supports, paid and unpaid, that are needed to achieve it. And the goal of person-centered planning is that these activities are directed by the person and supported by people that they choose. And person-centered practices in general are the alignment of those services and systems so that people have the full access and benefits to community living and delivery of services that facilitates the achievement of their goals. So you can see in all these three definitions that we're really just keep going back to the person. What is useful for them? What is valued to them? How can we help facilitate them achieving a quality of life, activities in life that are in alignment with their values? So I'm going to move on to the next slide, and these are just some examples. So this would be non-person-centered approaches, and I've been in the field for a long time, and I also am a family member of 2 family members who've had traumatic brain injuries, and so I have seen on both sides of the coin non-person-centered approaches. So, you know, starting with narrow and presumptive assessments and evaluations. So I know somebody mentioned in the chat room, and I'm sorry that if I skipped this over, but talking about people living with brain injuries who are being served by general, you know, community waivers. So not specific brain injury waivers, but the Medicaid waivers for supporting people living with disabilities, people living with developmental or intellectual disabilities, and older adults. And so we see that there are people living with brain injuries who are in those services as well. They are receiving supports. So for example, if somebody comes into a program, either through Medicaid or not, coming in, say, for mental health, coming in for an addiction or trauma, and if that person is not asked about their history of brain injury, you could really be missing the boat. Treatment plans that consist of a checklist. So this is probably Stasia's pet peeve, because I think it's just so reductionist, and it does not allow those who may be working with the people currently or in the future to really see them as a full person. A checklist is not a full person. Use of medical jargon, and it's not accessible to the individual. It may meet the accrediting bodies when they come to, like, say, CARF, Commission on Accreditation of Rehab Facilities, and they show up and they look at the treatment plan and go, oh, a thing of beauty, because they're speaking the language. But for people who are receiving the services and working with a team, this makes no sense to them. It should be something that is very personal. It should have examples specific to them. And treatment plans that are embedded in the electronic medical record, again, not the best. I've gone and had, I thought, pretty reasonable conversations with treatment providers, and when I suggested that people walk out of the office after the assessment period with their treatment plan in hand, I was told, well, why would I do that? So, you know, we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. And of course, treatment is not individualized to the person. So you met one person living with a brain injury, you met one person living with a brain injury. So the treatment that one person receives for their visual problems is not the same that somebody else might benefit from. And I have 2 examples that are examples of not person-centered approaches. And yes, I see the CARF is very person-centered. Thank you. No, I know they've done a lot of work in that area. But back when I was working in programs, it wasn't, the providers were not writing in a way that was person-centered. And the attorney living with a brain injury. So say, for example, somebody who's a working attorney, went through law school, very established in his career, and then he comes into a rehab program and he has speech and language therapist who gives him very generic reading comprehension exercises. That means nothing to that individual. Now, he's probably somebody with a good work ethic and he'll give it a go, but that's not exactly a person-centered approach to addressing the issues with comprehension and learning that he may be dealing with. Another example, a young woman who has severe cognitive, behavioral, and physical issues secondary to a fall from a great height, say, or a motor vehicle accident. And her goal, very highly educated, is to return to the classroom of some sort, to continue her learning. And the team says to her, well, that's unrealistic. You know, sometimes that word comes out of people's mouths. They don't mean to dismiss people, but perhaps, you know, trying to prevent that person from having a failure or having a disappointment. And again, we need to give people the dignity of risk. So I'm going to move on to person-centered approaches using those same two examples. So holistic and flexible intake process. So in person-centered planning, it is well acknowledged that it's very time intensive on the front end. That is for good reason. You want the individual who's coming for supports and the people who are going to be providing and aligning with them to get to know each other, to understand what exactly that person might need. So there's more time intensive. The treatment plan is the culmination of an assessment process and conversations, consulting with the individual. The person brings in supporters, people who are important in their lives. It could be you know, their minister, it could be their neighbor, it could be a family member, but those folks are welcomed as part of the team. And then the treatment plan is written in a personal, jargon-free manner, and the individual is given a copy. So, you know, back when I worked in an outpatient program, when I first came, it was very jargony. It was written in language that, unless you really understood rehabilitation language for speech OT and physical therapy, you might have a hard time understanding what that means in real terms for a person's life. And so we worked very hard at making sure that our treatment plan was free of lingo, was written very personally to the individual. And then going back to our attorney, you know, this is a person, again, highly successful in their career, and in conversation with a speech and language therapist, she's like, you know, I don't think it's going to cut it to give this gentleman generic work from a book that I have on cognitive therapy. So let's pull out the LSAT, you know, the law school exam. Let's pull out some law briefs and use selected paragraphs from those documents to address the same issue. In the case of the young woman, you know, the treatment team, knowing her well, understood it wasn't necessarily about going on and getting more degrees, realizing that what she was missing was the camaraderie of the school environment, being in a place where people loved learning. And so they started working with her to identify a class that she could audit. And that really added so much to her quality of life. So we can go on to the next slide. So there are some barriers to person-centered approaches. And I think we've heard quite a few of those already from Ann and Kelly. Sometimes we cannot find the professionals that we need. Sometimes we do find them, but we may have our speech therapist at one side of town and the occupational therapist is on the other. How do I coordinate? How do I get those two to talk to each other? How do I get those two to share their information with a neurologist who's following me? Oftentimes we'll hear people have been started on a new medication for a seizure disorder. What does that neurologist probably really want? They would love to have some feedback from the people who know that person to see if it's maybe improved their level of fatigue, because a lot of people as mentioned, experience fatigue after an injury. But it's really hard to coordinate, gathering that information, sharing it with the prescriber, tweaking it based on the observations of the person who are working with them, their family members, and the person themselves. This is great, but I'm still feeling really sleepy in the morning, and that's when this job is available to me. So what can we do? The other problem is for people, especially long-term people living with brain injuries over a long time. And remember, people are surviving with brain injuries. The people that I worked with as a young woman are now, like me, smack dab in middle age. And so changes in all of us as we age needed additional supports, little tweaks, somebody who understands our history. It's maybe really difficult to find those supports where we need them. Some individuals may have had that injury just after they would have qualified for, say, in our state, developmental disability funding. So they had that brain injury at 23. So it's now harder to maybe find those long-term services and supports. People don't know where to look. And I am also, again, I'm going to take another opportunity to just give another shout out to our local brain injury associations and alliances. I think that some areas are the best kept secret. And if people contact them who are having any kind of issues, and it's not just for family members and people living with brain injuries, but for professionals. Back when I was working in the field, I certainly took advantage of my association if I needed to find somebody in another part of town or another part of the state that could support the person that I was working with. But these are the kind of things that are barriers to delivery of services. And I think both Kelly and Ann really spoke quite personally as to what that means, in your life, not to have that comprehensive, holistic approach to care. So we can go on to the next slide. So I'm just kind of going to wrap this up because I do have 2 more questions for Ann and Kelly. So one of the problems that we do see is people do find services. Say I'm living with an addiction to alcohol, and I do get into a program, and my insurance will pay for it. But because of my attention problems, I might not be able to sit through the group in the ways they expect me to. I look so good. I recovered physically from that injury, but I'm having a hard time processing. I don't follow through with my homework. I have trouble understanding what people are saying in a noisy environment. And either I stay disengaged, I may nod my head and look like I'm paying attention, but I'm not really getting a lot of value out of that rehab. Or I may be somebody who gets really flooded with emotion because my frontal lobe, my temporal tips were injured when I was a young woman. I may not be able to regulate my thoughts from coming out of my mouth. I get really angry at the counselors or my peers. I lose the ability to connect with my peers. I lose that ability to get that support. And I end up being, what sometimes is a terrible phrase, but, treatment failure. Either I leave because I feel like I'm not getting what I need and it's hard to advocate for myself, or they say, I'm sorry, Stacia, but we have limited slots for people and I don't think you're really using our services. So, maybe go see a counselor and come back when you're ready. And so this is the kind of thing that can happen to people living with that hidden brain injury. Even if it's not so hidden, it can still happen that their needs are not met in services that are not brain injury informed, which means they're not being person-centered. Because to be person-centered, you really need to peel back that onion and ask people about their history. So with that being said, I would like to ask, Kelly and Ann, what are your experiences? And Kelly, I'll start with you. What is not person-centered, in your opinion?
Well, I love the example you gave about the attorney going and having for speech therapy and given a very basic worksheet, which wasn't going to help him get back to work. But the same thing happened to me, to Olivia, especially going through the school system. They would teach for the average student, and they couldn't figure out how to teach exactly for her. And even when she was pulled out for services, she'd be pulled out with a group of other children who had varying disabilities. There could be, autism and ADHD, and especially with the behavior issues, which she was the opposite of behavior issues. So I would make a point of every single year, I would meet with her teachers before school started, because I started this when she was in preschool, and would basically lay out what happened to her, why, what type of learning issues she had, and how to best work with her and what she needed from them. And I know a lot of the teachers were very annoyed that they had to meet with me, but I had it written into her IEP. And but quite a few came back to me later on and said how helpful that was, because, quite honestly, she looks like your average young lady. You would never know. Doesn't have any type of physical disability. So people, when they see her, they're not expecting what they get. And then the same with me. I use the example of the cognitive therapy that I had. It was very basic. There was no thought to what I personally needed versus what the textbook said. So I've had to piecemeal her therapies in for what I feel is best suited for her. And
that kind of leads me to my next question. What were those strategies? Can you name one or two that were really helpful for your daughter?
Yeah, I would say right now that the biggest help for her has been being involved with a music therapy organization. And they do music therapy, but they also do performance therapy, where they go out into the community, especially to the middle and high schools, and they teach the students what it is to have a disability. And it's not just brain injury, although brain injury is represented obviously by Olivia, and there's a couple other young people. But her confidence has just blossomed. Her ability to deal with her injury has, it's been amazing. And they do other programs also for her, but probably that has been the number one therapy of all the therapies we've done. That's probably I feel has brought the most to her. And again, it was person-centered. I meet with them. They tell me what they think her goals should be, and her goals are for her, not for anybody else in the organization.
That's right. Thank you. That's a great example. Anne, I'm going to ask you pretty much the same thing. Can you give an example of something in your experience that is not person-centered? Oh, we can't hear you.
Got it.
There we go. The system wasn't very person-centered, and just trying to find your own therapy when you have a brain injury is crazy. And I guess I felt like a lot of people would ask these questions of me that were just like, who's got the brain injury? So the system wasn't, I'm going to kind of move forward to things that were person-centered, and then pull back, which is to say, 3.5 years after my injury, I was successful in getting to a rehab hospital and getting a speech therapist. And it was only later that I realized how person-centered what she was doing was. And I had never heard the term person-centered, so I was just sort of attaching that label. She was the first person to know that when my husband, then boyfriend, now husband, proposed to me. And so I'm not kidding. Nobody else, she was the first person to know. I had therapy on Monday morning, and she was just like, well, we're going to make that your project, is figuring out how to organize a wedding. And everybody at that wedding participated in the wedding to help me. People would sit next to me just to help me get my attention so that I could do things. And they'd say, we're not doing anything. And I'd go, no, I can't do this without you. You don't get it. So person-centered, my husband, the speech and therapist, identified that public speaking was something that I had done before and could continue to do. we wrote my first speech was about my brain injury, helping me have awareness about what my injury was. And and then I was able to present that at the University of Texas. That was the hardest thing that I've ever done because I used to give impromptu speaking, and I had to read word for word, and I didn't know what it was about, even though I had written it with a cast of characters. And then an internship with the fellow, Dr. John Slayton at the University of Texas to help me, because technology is such an issue for me, to help me with technology. And he was in charge, he was blind, and he was in charge of technology and learning group, and launched my career in public speaking by saying, the blind, here are the problems with the blind, go solve it for that injured. And then I just want to say that recently I was able to go back to my doctor with the need to get more speech and language therapy. And through Zoom technology, we're able to, she knows I need it, but has said there's nobody that she felt was qualified in Austin to help me with the kinds of things I had. So she's reconnected me over Zoom with my former speech therapist in Northern Virginia, which is wonderful. And so those are some examples of what were person-centered. And just for me, there was always this disconnect because I'd been told so many times you can't get help, or you're doing too well, or whatever. And then all of a sudden somebody's coming along and really helping you, but it wasn't explained to me, you can't get better after 2 years. People weren't all of a sudden explaining to me that I had moved to rehab land, that the philosophy was totally different, and that they believed in my neuroplasticity. And so I'd never heard the term before, so I didn't connect all that.
Thank you, which means basically our brains continue to grow and improve for years and years until we take our last breath. Thank you. Thank you. And I'll turn it back over to.
And let me just say that I'd had that attitude. I'd had to have that attitude as a strategy, was to just keep having that attitude. And it's funny because when I met that attitude coming back, I didn't always know what to do with it.
You were surprised. Thank you. So are we ready for questions and answers at this point?
We are. Thank you so much, everybody, for your really rich conversation and contributions to this discussion. We have a number of questions that have come in, and Bevan is going to be moving us through to the questions. We've moved through a few of the last slides, but those will be included in the PDF that you can download. So Bevan, are there a few questions for our panelists?
Yes, there are some wonderful questions that have come in, and also some cool kind of conversations happening on chat. So here's what I would suggest we do. We have, I guarantee that we have more questions than we'll have time to answer in the next 10-15 minutes, which is fine because our speakers have graciously agreed to help us create a unanswered question and answer document that will live on the website along with the recording of this webinar, the slides, plain language summary of the webinar so that folks can access it in different ways. So look out for all of that within the next couple of weeks on ncaps.acl.gov. But there are a few questions I would like to be sure to get to. And before I ask the first one, we did get a bunch of questions related to kind of like, are there resources out there for, such and such? And one thing that I'd like to suggest is we have hundreds of experts on the webinar now as participants. So if you like, chat into the chat box any resources that you find valuable or that you like. If you chat to all panelists and attendees, it'll come out to everybody. But even if you just chat into us, we will include that list in the materials that we post on our website, okay? So let's do a little bit of crowdsourcing of good related resources and materials out there. And in the meantime, we'll ask our panelists some additional questions. So the first question is for Kelly and Anne. is if you are seeking services from a brain injury organization or a state agency, what would you want the service provider to do or say first? And so maybe we can start with Kelly.
This is from anyone who's giving me any type of service. And there was one provider who did this, and I can't tell you how much it meant. She started off the meeting, she had done an evaluation, and she looked at both my husband and I, and she said, wow, you have been through such a trauma. And so she just validated everything, which I can't tell you what that means as a, to hear that.
Thank you. And Anne, how about you? What would you want a service provider to do or say first?
Gosh, Kelly, that was a great, I love that, because I was going to say, sort of establishing a personal connection and validation. And I think Kelly just gave it as an example from her life. I know that asking me about my history, part of it was that I couldn't connect my history. And so I couldn't identify a number of things. It was actually my media presence that connected a lot of dots for me that I couldn't connect. And so just the concept of asking me wasn't going to get me anywhere. And on the flip side, I kind of got used to thinking, oh, I'll write this up ahead of time, right? And one hospital administrator told me, if you can write this up, you don't need our services, which I don't think was true. It was sort of like this catch-22, like, and so don't expect the person with a brain injury to be able to connect all the dots is, I guess, what I want to make people aware of in that opening statement, and establishing trust and personal communication, I think, is so important.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks, Kelly. All right, this question is for Stasia. What contributed to your understanding of the elements and importance of person-centered thinking, planning, and practice? What training and practice opportunities were you able to access that may not have been available to other practitioners?
I think, first of all, early in my career, I worked at the head trauma program at New York University. And that's where I learned how to write treatment plans that were individual letters to the person. I didn't know the term person-centered, but those certainly were person-centered descriptions of the challenges people were having in language that was relevant to the barriers they themselves were experiencing. So that was number one, and that was back in the 80s. And then moving forward, by being at the Behavioral Health Administration, I've been able to take advantage of training with Diane Greeter and a number of other trainers at the training center at the School of Medicine, University of Maryland School of Medicine. So Diane is very prominent in person-centered planning in the behavioral health realm. And so I learned a lot about assessment, how you pull information together, and then how to organize a treatment plan in a very person-centered way that really engages the individual. And then subsequent to that, I was able to, because of a collaboration with our Department of Aging, I could certify as a 2-day person-centered thinking trainer through the learning community for person-centered practices. And so I took, both of those schools of thought and just tried to meld them together. And when I do training with our brain injury professionals. So I don't know if that answers your question, but, and again, just I worked in services for 16 years and really saw, again, not using that term person-centered, but really seeing what the difference it made when our team really approached people where they were and not where we thought they should be or where they wanted them to be. So I think all those were really critical in kind of forming, my thoughts about this. And again, I am a family member as well. And, I could tell you stories that really shocked me because I think, well, doesn't everybody know about person-centered practices? No, they don't. That's magical thinking on my part. So we still have a lot of work to do, but I am really glad that I have been so fortunate to be exposed to, Michael Schmoll's group, and again, Diane Greeter have just been so generous in allowing me to take what I've learned and try to apply it to working in the field that I do.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another question for Kelly and Ann. How have you managed working with employers before, during, and after employment? Have you found supportive employers, and what accommodations in employment have been helpful to you?
I can't really answer the question since I have not been able to return to work because I'm Olivia's primary caregiver because she cannot drive, and the public transportation near us is very limited, so I can't answer that question.
Got it. And Ann, you're on mute.
Is that better? So I guess the first question that I would say was that my boss was very supportive, or not, I mean, as much as she understood she was supportive of holding my job open for me until I came back. And the lack of on the one hand, I was like, I can't get back without rehab, right? And on the other hand, she didn't understand, and nobody really understood what was it that I needed to be able to get back to work. And that left a lot of burden on me because I felt this, I should be able to get back to work, or this, just this difficult situation. There weren't a lot of resources at the time to explain to my employer and help educate them. Fortunately, there are now. Like Kelly, I have not gotten back into, I mean, I do things as a consultant and do some is just volunteer work and some is paid work, but I have I'm grateful to be married after my injury and have a 10-year-old son. And so my primary goal is actually to be a mom. And even though you asked about employment, I think being a mom requires a lot more cognitive skills and multitasking than I ever had to do in my own work where I had a lot of independence. And that has been this huge source of frustration with me, also with technology that and so I would actually say that you need rehab to be a mom too. So I can't answer the a mom or dad or whatever. That's an area where multitasking and a lot of hearing people correctly, remembering all these things are so important. The good news about having a child is they keep you very motivated to try to stay ahead of them. And I think that is much better rehab than much more reward. When it's rewarding, much more rewarding rehab. And when it's not rewarding, much less rewarding rehab. But there's some good things about that. I'm grateful to be a mom.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, I want to say that it is really exciting to see all of the resources flooding in over chat. How awesome. It makes me feel like we need to keep the conversation going, and we will. And Alex is going to talk a little bit more about that momentarily. But I will tell you that we will do some work and compile all of the resources that were sent in on chat into a document that will be posted publicly. And the slides and recording of the webinar will also be posted publicly. I have one just kind of last question that I'll throw out to all three of the presenters, and that's just because we've gotten a ton of questions in chat, of people coming from personal experiences. I'm looking for help, I don't know where to go, and I wonder if you could each share just sort of your top resources that you would recommend people start with in terms of where to go, in addition to knowing that we will follow up with more.
Sure. This is Stacia. For me, when I get calls, and I still get calls to our administration's offices looking for resources from around the country, because they Google us and we pop up. And so I typically, if they're out of state, I find them their state brain injury affiliate association or alliance. If they're in state, I certainly give that to them. I give them a name if I know a name. I also have a list of resources that when I train, I give to people in hand, but I also send that out. And I would say brainline.org, and I believe that is on the last slide, one of the last slides is a resource. So brainline.org has content that's almost overwhelming, but you can narrow down your search, and it has built-in videos with experts and people with lived experience. It has blogs and columns by spouses, partners, people who are living with brain injury. Lots of good resources on Brainline. So just give a shout out to them for keeping, a lot of us informed about what's going on.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, over to you, Alex.
Okay, so as we get going into our real-time evaluation, just apologize for not quite getting this up and running. Look at that. I think I can get the evaluation questions going. I apologize for technical difficulties. I did call a friend in to help us, but it looks like this is open now. So attendees should be able to respond to the questions that we have open. I'm not actually seeing responses come in, so I'm not exactly sure why that is. So that's why I'm calling my friend.
And
I'm going to take 1 minute to explain to you a little bit about the continued work that we're doing in this area of brain injury and person-centered practices. In addition to this webinar, we are getting ready to launch a learning collaborative, which is focused on supporting states, tribes, and territories, or teams from states, tribes, and territories who are responsible for setting up services and systems for people with brain injury. So this learning collaborative will be an opportunity for teams to come together and really focus on how best to deliver supports and services for people. The Learning Collaborative will be starting with an expert meeting that we are getting together in September of this year, and then there will be additional outreach and recruitment will be starting in October of this year. So please watch for that if you're interested. This information about the Learning Collaboratives and other NCAPS information is all available on the NCAPS website, and there's the link to that at the very end. So now I still see that we have some polls, some votes coming in. Thank you for everybody's participation. And in about 5 seconds, I will be closing the voting. I know there's a number of questions on here, so we want to make sure that that everybody has a chance to work their way through the questions as you scroll down. Okay, so I will just be ending the polling for this. Oh, and I'm hearing a little bit of a request to leave it up as people are responding. We'll leave it up for another minute. As Stacia mentioned, there are resources, which is one of the final slides in this presentation. These are all available by downloading this slide presentation, and this, of course, will also be on the NCAPS website. Okay, so we're going to end polling at this point, and I would like to share results briefly. We can share the results as well. This is something that we like to share with people, but we are feeling that, really grateful to you, our presenters, for having shared such deep and rich information. At this time, we're going to move to the very end of the presentation. As you can see, there is a link to the upcoming webinar, well, actually to the NCAPS website, where you can register for upcoming webinars as the registrations are open. And as I mentioned, we have a learning collaborative focused on person-centered practices for people with brain injury. And at this time, we are just at 4:31 on the East Coast, so I really appreciate everybody's time and focus. And please stay in touch with NCAPS. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.